West of the Missouri River, there were no trees. Expensive to haul lumber such great distances by wagon train. So with typical American ingenuity, the pioneer of the 1870s and 80s used the materials available, the tough prairie sod, to build his home on the Sod House Frontier. In cooperation with the University of Nebraska State Museum, the Nebraska State Historical Society Museum, the National Association of Educational Broadcasters, and the Educational Television and Radio Center, University of Nebraska Television presents The Great Plains Trilogy, a series in 3 parts dealing with the land and the early inhabitants of that area of the United States known as the Great Plains. Series 3, Explorer and Settler, the White Man Arrives. Program 10, The Sod House Frontier, featuring Dr. James C. Olson.
You know, I've been looking again at this picture showing the type of homes used by the pioneers on the plains. And as I've looked at it, I couldn't help but contrast this type of life with the type of life enjoyed by people on the plains today, with air conditioning, refrigeration, and all of the modern conveniences enjoyed in the mid-20th century. What a difference there is between life on the plains today and life on the plains when the sod house was the principal type of dwelling. The sod house, such as this one you see here, is an enduring symbol of the pioneer period on the plains, and it, of course, is the symbol for our visit today, which is going to be about life on the Sod House Frontier. First, let's take a look at this map here and see just where the Sod House Frontier existed. This map shows North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. Now, the Sod House Frontier also extended down into Oklahoma and Texas, but our primary concern is with the northern plains. You'll recall a few visits ago that I indicated where the timber line was, that is, where the trees no longer grew. Well, now, let's review that. Roughly west of everything along this line, and it even extends over into Minnesota and Iowa here, down through eastern Nebraska and eastern Kansas. In other words, virtually all of the states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas, except for a few areas along the rivers, were timberless. And so the pioneers in these states couldn't build log cabins, the traditional home of the American pioneer east of Mississippi. Instead, they had to use the only material available, the tough prairie sod. Here is a block of it, Nebraska marble. The pioneers in Nebraska called it, and those in Kansas called it Kansas marble. You know, it's a very interesting thing to think that hunks of sod like this could be built into walls like this, and also cut a little thinner. They were used for the roof, as you can see here. Well, now, there were a variety of sod houses, from the very simple to the more elaborate. I have some pictures here which will indicate some of the types of sod houses. The first kind built was usually simply a dugout. This one is a little more elaborate than some because it has a lean-to built on it. And here is still another dugout. This one has several windows, or rather 2 windows and 2 doors, and it's more than just a hole in the ground, but still basically it is a dugout. You'll notice too there's a cow on the roof of this particular dugout. Well, now, as soon as possible, the pioneers tried to build a house completely above ground, and this picture shows an average sod house being built, having been built completely above ground. It was a one-room, very simple affair. The pioneers tried to bring beauty into their lives by planting flowers, and sometimes the roof made a good flower garden. This one up here, you see some sunflowers growing wild on the roof, and here in this picture, you see flowers on the roof of this ordinary sod house. Now, on occasion, some rather pretentious sod houses were built, such as this 2-story house here near Broken Bow, Nebraska. This rather pretentious sod house, which had a shingled roof and also had a circular staircase connecting the first floor and the second, still stands in central Nebraska. It was built for Isidore Beaumont. Well, now, here's a sod house of very advanced design. If you would take away the windmill and the family in their 19th century clothing, this sod house would look like a good many of the ranch-type houses being built in the cities all through the plains today. The sod house, in some respects, was a rather well-designed house. Now, the sod house had many drawbacks. It was very difficult to keep clean, and of course, no one really liked to live in a house built of dirt or sod. And as soon as possible, the pioneer tried to get out of his sod house and into a frame house. Actually, of course, the sod house was warmer in winter and cooler in summer than the uninsulated frame house which followed it. Well, now, I could spend our entire visit talking about life in a sod house and on the Sod House Frontier, but let's go into a sod house and see just exactly what life was like on the Sod House Frontier. Let's go into this perhaps little better than average sod house, reconstructed in the museum of the Nebraska State Historical Society, and look in on the inhabitants. Here you see a little girl playing with her doll in a crib. Mother is sitting in a chair and churning butter. It's early morning. Father is probably out doing the chores. People got up early on the Sod House Frontier, and there was always plenty of work for everyone. The average sod house was a one-room affair. Kitchen, bedroom, and parlor, all in one. You can see that it is rather crowded. Apparently satisfied with the butter, Mother is now going about the preparation of breakfast. The stove she has in her home, like the sod house itself, represents an effort to adapt life to the demands of the plains. It is not a coal burner, but a hay burner. You'll notice the cartridges. They're arranged to feed the hay into the firebox. Wood for fuel as well as for building purposes was a serious problem on the Sod House Frontier. Many substitutes were tried: corn, sunflowers, and other materials. But prairie hay seemed about the best, and it, of course, was far from satisfactory. It burned quickly, and the great quantities which had to be stored in the house were a fire hazard as well as a nuisance. The kerosene lamp, which Mother is blowing out, was something of a labor-saving device, and something of an advance over the candles which many families used on the Sod House Frontier. You'll notice the walls of the sod house. They were whitewashed to make them a little more attractive. The cradle could very well have been used by the little girl when she was a baby. She's using it now for her doll. And the doll was given to Christina Duggar of Bridgeport, Nebraska by her mother in 1883. Apparently, the little girl is going to have to quit playing with her doll now and perhaps help her mother. You notice the bedstead in the background. It occupied a large share of the room in the sod house. It was brought from the east. The quilt on the bed is the old Rose of Sharon pattern. Its bright figures provided a popular design in the 19th century. Notice the care, too, with which the little girl is fixing the pillow shams. At the foot of the bed is a quilted coverlet. The coffee pot is of pewter. And notice the coffee mill. Not all families could afford to have coffee. That little canister out of which she is going to take the coffee beans indicates how precious coffee was. Many families were so poor that they had to use parched corn at times as a substitute for the coffee bean. This coffee mill or coffee grinder was a fairly advanced instrument, and of course it is similar to home coffee mills used today. You'll notice the coffee pot has a covered spout. Notice, too, the heavy iron tea kettle. And to speed the coffee-making process up, Mother is using hot water. She's using the ground coffee bean rather, sparingly, only 2 tablespoons. This cabinet was made from a walnut tree that grew near Lincoln, Nebraska. It was made in 1869 by John Perkins for Isaac K. Young. It served as a storage place for the meager supply of dishes and other utensils. The drop leaf table is now being adjusted so that it can be used as a breakfast table. The knives and forks are metal with bone and wooden handles. The spoons are coin silver, the type that probably would be brought from the East. Most of the dishes are the practically indestructible ironstone, which could stand heavy jolting in a covered wagon, on a pioneer railroad, and heavy use in the sod house. Father apparently has finished his chores. Perhaps he's done a little hunting, too. The lantern lighted his way through his pre-dawn work. Although game provided fresh meat for the table, not all settlers had guns like this, and many were unable to afford shells to use their weapons. For that reason, they didn't waste shells on target practice or wild shooting. Each shell had to count for meat on the table. The heavy brass pail, probably brought from the East. The soap, however, was made from grease by the mother. Large quantities were needed for the immense washings, usually on Monday, or on Monday and Tuesday. The pioneer mothers frequently said that it should be wash days rather than wash day. The towel is homespun linen. Notice the calico curtains help to decorate the window. Father is reaching for his long-stemmed pipe, but apparently Father isn't going to get a chance to smoke his pipe before breakfast. His mother is now putting breakfast on the table. The breakfast, consisting of oatmeal, bread, and coffee, is really rather luxurious. Cornmeal mush and coffee often were the menu for each meal. Corn could be prepared many ways, but it still tasted like corn, and many of the pioneers said that after they grew up, they never wanted to taste cornmeal in any form again. Butchering provided welcome fresh meat for the diet, but the meals were at best monotonous. As one pioneer wrote his mother in the East, our meals are somewhat varied, though rather monotonous. Our diet consists of bread and pork and bread. The cup the little girl is using has the handle broken off, but of course it still continues to be used. Notice the rough cottonwood floor. This will warp in time. The little girl is barefoot, as well she might have been, even though she were considerably older. Many photographs of young girls on the Sod House Frontier show them all dressed up, but barefoot. While the family is eating, let's look around the house a bit. Newspapers sometimes were used to paper a part of the wall. This one is the Omaha Daily Republican, October 2, 1879. And this old iron is typical of the period, and of course it was heated by being placed on the hay-burning stove. Here is a spice cupboard. Spices were ground by hand and kept in small drawers in cabinets. And on top, his father's shaving mug and razor. He by no means tried to shave every day. Sometimes he didn't shave all season. And this is Dr. J.C. Ayer's American Almanac, 1888. Matches were kept in an iron safe to prevent unexpected fires. And here's a dough cutter and a rolling pin, and a potato masher. These were homemade. And there's a little homemade wooden scoop and a butter mold. Butter molds were used to mark the butter distinctively. And there's a little crockery vessel. And you can see a scissors and spatula. They were both hand forged. You'll notice it's early in the morning. The clock says 5:35 a.m. This particular clock was brought to Nebraska in the 1870s. This bird cage has stuffed birds in it. Sometimes the settlers tried to keep cages of wild birds. Their music helped to pass away the time and make life a little less lonely. Mementos to friends and relatives were wreaths made of locks of hair. Some fine articles of furniture were brought from the East for the new home. This lovely dresser with its precious mirror is of the 1850-1860 period. There's a sewing basket on the dresser, and another lamp, and a card case hanging on the wall. Music filled the time also. A fiddler was popular at the neighborhood dances, which provided entertainment for those who lived for miles around. Apparently, breakfast is about over. It looks as though Father is heading for his pipe. Apparently, he's going to get a chance to smoke before going out for the day's work. Mother will sit and watch and visit a while before beginning the rest of her day's work. Well, we'll leave our family now and get back to our own discussion of the Sod House Frontier. Another problem on the plains was the problem of water. Water was as scarce as wood, and in some places scarcer. Let's take a look at this map once again to just see something about the problem of water. The problem was there are very few rivers on the plains. The Missouri, coming up here, of course, went on up through the Dakotas. The Platte came out through Nebraska, and there were the loops. And then there was the Kansas and the Republican. But on the whole, the rivers were rather few and far between, and particularly here in the western Dakotas and western Nebraska and Kansas on the high tablelands, it was very difficult to get water. Frequently, people had to dig wells as deep as 600 feet, and this was a real problem in the days before the development of well-digging machinery. Here is a shovel from the Museum of the Nebraska State Historical Society, which was used by Nels Christensen, a rather celebrated well digger in western Nebraska. Mr. Christensen estimated that he had dug several miles of wells with this shovel. You can see that it would be a very serious problem. The superstitious felt that they could tell where water was through the use of the witching stick, such as this one you see here, simply a forked stick. Well, the witching stick didn't operate very effectively, but it was another means of trying to find water. Well, now, on every farmstead in the early days, the well with the bucket on the end of a rope was a familiar sight, and of course it was something of a problem to get the water up. The real boon, of course, was the development of the windmill, which you see here. This windmill, which plays such an important part in the landscape of this Sod House farmstead, was a manufactured windmill. Many of the pioneers could not afford to purchase windmills, and so they had to build their own. The Platte Valley in Nebraska, for example, was the home of many homemade windmills, many of them of curious design. But the windmill, along with the six-shooter and barbed wire, really settled the West. Now, I've got some examples here of barbed wire, which helped to provide a means of fencing. Fencing was a serious problem in this area where there was no wood, because the rail fences, such as pioneers in the East had used, simply could not be built. Some of the pioneers tried to build sod fences, but they were not very satisfactory, and the term ugly as a mud fence comes from this period. Other pioneers planted Osage orange hedges, which grew tall and provided an effective barrier against cattle and other animals. And some of those Osage orange hedge fences still remain on the plains. But the real advance, of course, was barbed wire. Let's take a look at some of these early examples of barbed wire. Here's a very early one, a single strand of wire around which the barbs have been twisted. This was not very satisfactory because the barbs would not maintain their position. Other types of barbs were used. Here's a complicated barb. Over here is a rather heavy barb with a twisted strand of wire. Down here you have a double strand, and here a very heavy barb. And on down through here you can see various means to develop a satisfactory barbed wire. And it wasn't until the twisted barb and the twisted strand was developed that the satisfactory barbed wire fence came into being. But the barbed wire fence really solved the problem of fencing on the plains. Most of the pioneers on the Sod House Frontier were farmers, and agriculture early developed into the way of life on the plains. Now, in the beginning, of course, agriculture was crude and primitive, and many of the implements were simply hand tools, such as this plow, which you see here. It's sometimes known as a sod buster or a grasshopper plow, and it broke a good many acres of native prairie sod. Over here, we have a cultivator. This was a simple hand cultivator, which would cultivate only half a row at a time. Now, it was soon replaced by the horse-drawn cultivator, but for a good many years, the farmer walked behind the cultivator. As a matter of fact, for a while, some of the pioneers felt that it was a sign of laziness to sit down while you were doing your work. Now, another advance was the husking hook, or the corn husker, as it actually was called. This was developed by Mr. Lilly, and it greatly improved the corn husking process, which was done by hand, of course, for a good many years. Now, I've got some pictures here which show some of these early farming operations. Here's a threshing crew. The thresher was horse-powered. A little later, the steam engine came in to power the thresher. The traction engine was particularly beneficial because it not only would power the separator, but it also would haul it from place to place. Here's a haystacking operation. It looks much like the operation does today, except that the power was furnished by a horsepower rather than by the gasoline engine. Now, the binder was a great advance in the harvesting of small grain. Prior to the time of the twine binder, the grain had to be bound into bundles by hand. But this machine, drawn by horses, would bind the grain into bundles, and then the farmer could come along and put the bundles into shocks. Now, as I mentioned, corn husking or corn picking was for a long time a hand operation with the aid of the little hand hook. Here's a young corn husker with his the results of his day's labor in the cornfield, a wagon full of corn. The steam engine was used to power the corn sheller, and you can see the shelling operation going on here on the Nebraska prairies. Now, there were several problems faced by the pioneer farmer on the plains. One of them was periodic drought, which came to destroy his crops, and another was the insect pest. In certain years, notably the middle 70s, grasshoppers swarmed down on the plains by the millions, devouring virtually every growing thing. A number of devices were tried to exterminate the grasshoppers. Here's Uncle Swain Finch, a beloved pioneer in Custer County, trying to beat grasshoppers out of his corn with the use of a tree branch. Well, the drought and the grasshoppers were just two of the very serious problems faced by the pioneers on the plains. Well, life steadily improved on the Sod House Frontier. The sod house was replaced by a neat frame house and occasionally a brick house. Sod house itself frequently became a barn as its owners moved out of it and into the new house. But even though life did improve, life during the pioneer period on the Sod House Frontier was difficult at best. These shoes here, I think, help to illustrate just how difficult it was. We have them on display in the Museum of the Nebraska State Historical Society on this revolving table to emphasize to people that these, after all, are a symbol of hardship and of difficulty. The shoes were made by tacking cow skin over a cottonwood, just a piece of cottonwood. Very little effort was made to fit the shoes, and of course they were miserably uncomfortable at best. Even so, they were worn, and worn until they were worn out, as these were. They don't even match, you see, and they have holes in them as they have been worn out. They're something of a symbol of the hardship endured by those who lived on the Sod House Frontier. Then, in our S.D. Butcher collection of Sod House photographs, we have about 1,000 photographs of different Nebraska sod houses, and people who lived in the houses usually lined up in front of the houses. Now, these photographs are typical not only of Nebraska, but of all of the Plains states. We have some of them blown up, as you see this one here, to form backgrounds for our displays. And I tell our guides, as they're taking people through the museum, particularly school children, to call particular attention to the people whom you see in front of the sod houses. And I tell them to call attention to the people's eyes and their faces, to see the look of determination on their faces, to see the courage and the faith expressed in those eyes. Now, I tell them particularly that if they want to know what it was that built America and built the West, to look at the eyes of these people. Well, next week we're going to talk about another phase of Plains history, when we talk about the cowboy and the cattleman, the roundup, and the long drive up the trail from Texas, in a visit we'll call Cattle, the Birth of an Industry.
Dr. Olson is superintendent of the Nebraska State Historical Society and associate professor of history at the University of Nebraska. Next week, Program 11, Cattle, Birth of an Industry. In Series 3, Explorer and Settler, the White Man Arrives. All a part of the Great Plains Trilogy, produced for the National Association of Educational Broadcasters under a special grant from the Educational Television and Radio Center.